experience God in those relationships. So think about that as you go through this, as we watch the clip, and then we'll come back with your comments. If you want, there's some pencils back there. If you want to make some notes, is there anything that you hear that you want to unpack a little bit or just reflect on afterwards? Or anything you maybe disagree with? That's just as good as well. So I'll invite you to do that as we listen.
I think community matters because the Christian religion is inescapably communal. Jesus promises to be with us when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. That doesn't mean that individual Christians can't feel Christ's presence. The faith has a very long tradition of private prayer and meditation on Scripture. But if we take those scriptures to heart, I think over and over again we'll find that they're sort of shouting at us, it's not about you. It's not about just you. And I'm convinced that really one purpose of all the great religions of the world is to kind of remind us of that and deflate our egocentricity, deflect our selfishness so that we can devote our energies to serving others and to be a part of the whole world. It's not just about us. But to talk about community in this sense strikes me as countercultural. We're constantly exhorted in American culture to be always concerned with our individual rights and our needs. Narcissists make very good consumers. They're good for the economy. Sometimes I think that most of us walk around in a little haze thinking, you mean I'm not the center of the universe? I mean, something will happen to remind us that we're not. But we walk around in that sort of haze. But I think people do have a deep need for community, and that for relationship of all kinds. I remember after 9/11 reading an article by a woman in New York who said she envied people who had a place of worship to go to. She was longing for community but didn't really know how to go about finding it. I once met a woman who joined a church after years of yoga practice because she felt lonely. A stranger on an airplane actually helped her find the Episcopal Church, and she now speaks of feeling blessed by that encounter, and she still does her yoga. Well, churches now often have classes and worship services for people identified as seekers, people who may have been raised in another religious tradition or no religious tradition. They've come to the church to seek a community of faith, a community in which they can feel at home. And I hope churches do what they can to help people be realistic in this seeking, coming to terms with the fact that a church congregation is full of ordinary human beings. It is not a perfect place. I joined a church as an adult at a time when people in the congregation had been attacking the pastors, a clergy couple who were my good friends. There were secret meetings, hate mail, ugly rumors. These tensions had caused such serious disruptions within the congregations that lifelong friends had stopped speaking to each other. This church was, in a sense, just repeating a pattern that they'd been engaged in for years, booting pastors out after this kind of turmoil. And I think when churches do repeat that behavior, it's often that they're scapegoating pastors for problems that run very deep within the congregation itself, but which the people in the church are refusing to face. Well, I still think it was an example of God's sublime sense of humor that I needed to join the church in the midst of all of this. It was so absurd, it was funny in a grim way, but it also proved a great advantage because I had to join the church with no illusions. I had not found some ideal community that would meet all my spiritual needs. But grace did rear its head on the Sunday I joined. I remember lying there thinking it would be so nice just to stay in bed this morning. But then getting to church before the service, I was formally greeted as someone who would be joining. I was formally greeted by the church elders, and the head elder said awkwardly while looking at his shoes, I'd like to welcome you to the body of Christ. Now, this was a man I had never liked. It was a small town. I knew him. I thought I knew him. I had never liked him, but I realized I had just been commanded to love him because we were both members of the body of Christ, and I thought, oh my Lord, what am I getting myself into? Even Groucho Marx never came up with something that good, although he once did have the useful insight that he was mistrustful of joining any group that would have him as a member. I don't think that's a bad way to look at the Christian community. One big breakthrough came when I was finally able to reject that familiar tactic. I certainly used it a lot as an adolescent, of judging Christians to be nothing but a bunch of hypocrites. Well, that's a reason a lot of people give for not joining a church. It occurred to me one day that the only hypocrite I needed to worry about on Sunday morning was myself. I also began to value worship more because it contains both praise and lament, and we need to be free to express both emotions before God and others in community, and worship allows for that. I often meet people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious. I don't want to be part of organized religion. And I used to say that about myself. And now I just say, well, if you don't want to be part of organized religion, just join a church. I think the wonder of Christianity is that the church has survived so long with so much diversity within, so motley a crew of believers and doubters, so much bad behavior mixed in with the good. The church is a body. It's not a trade union, a club with members who think alike. And yet it's always somehow greater than the sum of its parts. The church is the opposite of a self-selected group, and sometimes I look around the congregation and I think only God would be crazy enough to bring this group together. Who is welcomed into the Christian community is always one of those ancient issues. Who's welcomed into the Christian community is one of those ancient issues that is always new. A church historian I know once made this comment that I found useful. Whatever conflict is going on that we think of as ours, as modern, the church has been here before. Our current battles over diversity and inclusion, who can be a member of the community, who can serve as pastor or bishop, are nothing new. This diversity certainly is reflected in the four Gospels that have a very different view of Jesus and his ministry, and certainly the epistles, which are addressed to very different communities. And sometimes I wonder if the Corinthians, say, would recognize the Ephesians as Christians. Their concerns are different, their biblical interpretation seems different. So that diversity has been with us along with that unity. So I think the question of who belongs in the Christian community will always be with us. The first Christians were Jews who became followers of Christ. After that, pagans began converting, but they had not been Jews first. This was a big issue. And then a few centuries later, many Christians wanted to exclude people who had hedged their bets during the persecutions. Maybe they'd offered their standard prayers to the Roman emperor to save their lives, but now how could they be in the church with the families of the martyrs? And that created some very bitter schisms in early Christianity. In our own time, of course, the contested questions have been have centered around women and homosexuals, but it's really the same issue. From the very first centuries of Christian history, there have always been those whose first concern is with keeping the church pure, its members doctrinally and morally sound. If that means that only a small number of people qualify, it's okay. If it means fighting over doctrinal issues, a painful purging of the membership rolls, even inquisitions and executions, that's okay. It's worth it to keep the church pure. But there have also been people who have sought to make membership in the Christian community as broad as possible. The Roman society looked down on Christianity as a religion for slaves. To them, it was just beneath their consideration. I thank God, though, that there have always been those Christians who see the church as a place where all should be made to feel at home, educated or not, wealthy or poor. We're all just ordinary, flawed people who gather because we need to be reminded that God made us and accepts us and loves us and wants us to share that love with others. And that, to me, is the meaning of community.
Well, and how interesting that we all gather from a diversity of community. Well, maybe that's truer for me. No, and Kathleen, we come from afar, but you folks are all here. And anyway, your responses to Kathleen, as you were listening, where did you find a place of connection?
I just remembered walking into this place 22 years ago. The denomination my husband and I had been in for 40 years, which I still greatly respect, but it just wasn't fitting for me at the spiritual level. And someone said to me there's a beautiful church downtown, I was living out then, that has wonderful music that might feed your soul. And I remember walking in one Sunday and just being overwhelmed with the beauty and the color and then the procession, and my soul, which loves ritual, and I didn't know it. I can remember the homily, I can remember everything about it just fed me. And it was a warm and welcoming community. And when I began to connect here, and my husband decided he would stay in our former church, I knew, because then I was about, 65 or so, I thought, I'm coming in as a woman alone. So I introduced myself to everyone in the restroom, and I just did that, and I was so welcomed. Yeah, it was, and the spirituality, because we had a rich centering prayer tradition here at that time, and we had a lot of things that I could, and I remember the dean saying to me, I said, meditation's my thing. Oh, and he named the two priests who at that time were so connected. So it fed me at the deepest level. And still, in many ways.
I have to agree with you on that too, Margaret, in that, this church, I think for me, coming to a new country, being a little bit lonely, and, coming here, starting somewhere else, and then finally, like you, I actually Googled the church and saw cathedral, and I had always gone to a cathedral. And so coming in, I just walked in and I was like, wow, this is just, what I wanted. The ritual, which is exactly where I said, stand, sit, kneel. I like that. And the people, as soon as, the dean was right there greeting us and making us feel at home. And I've had 2 children baptized here, and I have a husband who's never around. He works out of state, so this has now become my community, my support system. People like Kim, Rebecca, etc. are people who I look forward to seeing on a Sunday because they're like family. It's now become, I'm going to see family, at church. So it's definitely fed my soul being here.
I think church is one of the last places for intergenerational connectedness. Families don't live together the way they used to, and that's something that I really appreciate. That I'm probably not going to have my own kids, and so here is a church full of children, because I'm far away from my nieces and nephews, and I'm friends with Margaret, and I just really value that, and that it can be a place, and a place where I'm challenged. One of the things that I had to think about becoming a priest was I worked with a job before seminary. I was doing social action and community organizing, and I was around a lot of people who thought the same way I did, and we were all working together on the same thing. And as a priest, I have to be a priest to be able to think very differently than I do, and I still have to find a place of authenticity and contact to be a priest. And I didn't want to go to a church where everybody was going to be like me. And my grandmother, before she died, she's an older Anglican. Before you gave the peace in church, she did not like to pass the peace in church. You don't go to church to touch people and talk to people. You talk outside. And I had been ordained before she died. And she said to me, Rebecca, when you're with the people in your church who are older and more like me, more conservative, remember how much we love each other. And I just carry that with me when I'm with people. So I'm really grateful for that gift of hers.
Can I tell one more story?
I'm gonna stop it there.
I was working with a
So we have a little time. Is someone mind getting the lights? Thank you. We have about 20 minutes here. So let's reflect on what did you guys what popped out of you at this? Yeah.
I really connected with the longing for community. In fact, I was listening to a story yesterday that the UK has now found that so many people are lonely that they've created a ministry of loneliness to reach out
Yeah.
to people who are identified as being alone or being lonely. And I think the church serves that purpose for a lot of people, just being a community.
Yeah, has anyone else heard that about an increase in loneliness and isolation in our world? I think it's one of the great ironies of social media
Yes. Right now.
is that it's created this sort of interconnected web. So we have this sense that we're heavily connected, almost overly connected. I know more about you people than I would ever imagine. But are those relationships deep? And there's an increase, there's all these studies that correlate depression with the amount of time you spend online in social media. It's not necessarily a substitute. I did a series a while back, and it was, I can't remember the name of the speaker, but her term was little sips of community. Social media lets us get little sips, but lots of little sips doesn't add up to one deep drink, of community, time together. Yeah.
I had to sort of laugh and chuckle to myself, Chris. Kathleen Norris's talk on community. If anybody here, I was active in Cursillo for many, many years. I know there's certain people here. And she just gave you hear 15 talks on a Cursillo weekend, and that's the fourth talk, Christian community.
What did Cursillo teach you about Christian community that has stuck with you?
Oh, gosh.
You give it anything that you probably.
Well, it's the gathering together in prayer and support.
Prayer and support.
The honesty that exists between the people so that they get to really know the hurts and the joys and the feelings of the people that are within that community.
And then something else they encourage to get in a small group after the weekend. I've been in a small group with one of the guys for 30 years, another guy 20 years, and another guy 10 years. And the three things you're supposed to, though we diverge, three things you're supposed to talk about. We meet only twice a month. And as for the week, what's been your closest moment to Christ or to God? What's been your study, Bible or Kathleen Norris, whatever, and then what's your action for the week? What did you do to help somebody come closer to God?
So there's an accountability element as well as
Accountability.
support. Yeah. Anybody here could consider themselves part of a small group of a Christian small group, so to speak? Okay, just a few. EFM, right? Yeah. What happens in a small group that doesn't happen in a large group?
Bonding.
Bonding.
Just being in a small group, you join, you keep in contact with where everybody is on a weekly basis. And if someone calls you and said, woke up with a bad dream and would you pray for me? Or, I've been to the doctor and so there's a lot of communication that goes on.
You know what's going on in each other's lives.
Right.
Yeah. You check up on each other.
My discussion question number 2 kind of goes to this. How do you know you're part of community? What's the tipping point for you when you feel like, okay, I'm now a part of this community? And I suggested the old refrigerator rights. You know what that is? When you were connected enough with someone that you can wander into their home and just go right into that fridge. Don't need to ask for permission. That's right. I got buddies from college that I'm like that with.
I think that's a male thing.
What would be a female version of that?
call somebody at a time when it otherwise wouldn't be appropriate.
Yeah.
At a time during the day when it wouldn't be appropriate, something like that.
Well, a couple of years ago during Lent, you had the spiritual autobiography set up, and the people who were, Stephanie and I were in the same group, but the people who were in our group are connected. We might not see each other often, but we have a much deeper connection, like when we do see each other,
Yeah.
than we would have before. That was very powerful.
Yeah, we'll do that again. That's basically, that was 5 weeks where you get together with a small group and share each other's spiritual journey. And each week, each person takes a turn, and it's you set the rules, right? It's confidentiality, and why do we do all that? Because you want to build trust, so people can be authentic and share, and not worry about as much about being judged or people whispering outside and all that. So you try to build trust, and when you have trust, then you can share more, and when you share more, the group grows deeper.
And it was interesting, a lot of people were afraid to join one of those groups.
Yeah.
But the people who did found it very meaningful, I think.
What's scary? Yeah. So what's scary about? Why do we want to avoid that type of?
We don't want to be judged.
Yeah.
We don't want to be vulnerable.
Well, and I think she talked about how things can kind of get ugly when people get close, and in a close community, things don't always go well. I think that's, somebody does talk outside, or whatever she was talking about,
Yeah.
politics of the church, and, getting involved with things that make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's sometimes there's that old expression, good was it good fences make good neighbors,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So what is that? What's behind that, right? It's that, I think, by keeping a certain separation, we know where our boundaries are. We can keep the Minnesota nice going. We don't have to run into those scary things or the messy part of relationships and community. How about some other feedback? What else did you hear from someone else that said something?
I think too, for me, the Episcopal Church is joining together at the Eucharist, that there's this center that brings us all together. We may come from different belief systems with all kinds of things, but we come together on a Sunday morning for the Eucharist. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to another denomination where there was no communion service, and it was basically just preaching and singing. And even though I knew a number of the people in that congregation, I didn't feel connected to them. It was just like everybody was a little individual, and the minister was putting on a show in the front. I mean, almost the whole service were sermons and, telling people what they need to do with their lives and so forth. And it just was like, I was a student back in school with a professor up there, and I was isolated from it. So I think the Eucharist is just bringing, everybody's coming forth for the same reason.
Yeah. Think about that in our own lives. Like, when you really want to get to know somebody, what do?
We eat together.
Don't we invite them over for dinner?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the best thing. And I never want to do it at a restaurant. It always feels like I'm keeping you. That's almost like a good fence. There's a little bit of distance, but there's something about coming to the intimacy of your home and coming to the table together, and something happens there that's different, isn't it?
Sharing.
And don't you think there's just a sense of that direct connection of the bread and wine, which is Christ, going into me, going into the person next to me or sitting next to me in the pew? I mean, it's to me, it's just a bloodline. It's a direct connect.
We could do a year's worth of forum series on the Eucharist and not even brush up against all of the reflection that has been done on the power and magic of that moment. But all kinds of reasons. Right? I love the idea of that it's a model. We model the oneness that God would call us to be. We practice that, symbolically at the Eucharist, so that we might have a shot at practicing it outside in our daily life. And that's why I said today at the 8 o'clock service, it's both the most simple act you could do and the most courageous at the same time, it seems to me. Other reflections. How about this question of what's the difference about Christian community versus other types of community? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Like professional stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. How about maybe you're a member of a book group, book club, or a charity?
Right. Now, I've shared this in our little discussion. I'm a member of a Nalshan group.
What is that?
And it's a
What religion is that?
It's a Chinese game that you play. It's like, it's a game you play. And we have one member, who is very different from the rest. And so we have to be very, very careful about what we talk about so that we don't upset her and lose her ability to play with us. And somehow or another, there's no basis to hold that group all together. There's not a common thing there. Three of us are sort of politically the same, and she's not at all where we are.
Kick her out, Stephanie. Kick her out.
Yeah.
Well, but that's what holds it together, is that you all have to act a certain way to keep her in the group.
So where in the Christian community, you do have that center, your belief in Jesus Christ, commonality.
You come from a common.
Something that you know you have, you don't have to search around for trying to find some little thing to hold you together.
What about
These
another?
two were saying to me, Chris, it reminded me of something that happened to me when I was in college. I was, I think, a sophomore, and a girl just as cute as can be told me, she said, well, I'm transferring next fall, Danny. I said, oh, where are you gonna go? And I'm from the Northwest, Washington State, and she said, well, I'm gonna transfer down to Seattle Pacific, which I think was a Methodist school originally. And I said, I knew that she went to church, and I said, well, why are you transferring a lot more money? She said, and we were like 21 years old, and she said, it's fun to be with people who believe like you do. And I've always remembered that, because you're much more comfortable, if you're in your, birds of a feather flock together, and if you're the odd man out, it's all a little awkward, sort of like your friend in Mahjong religion.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. Yeah. So other thoughts about this idea of gathering in the as Christ's body versus any other group that we might experience community in, and the difference that has in meaning in our lives.
I'll share mine. It's not that I think that I share the same belief as another person in the group, because I've heard in a small group descriptions of beliefs that are not my beliefs or not my perspective. But it's the goal that I have in the group, and that I think others in the group have, of seeing Christ in the other person's eyes, and of withholding or abandoning judgment. So it's as if we are striving to accept each other regardless of differences in backgrounds or beliefs, kind of like a family does, but maybe more harmoniously than a family. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that.
But when that's not there, like the different kind of a group, there isn't, the connection is a surface connection. It rarely goes deeper than that. People don't, they just go to the meeting, the professional meeting or whatever it is, and that's really the end of it. Sometimes people develop a deeper connection because they realize that they have something in common. But it's usually, that's just all it is what you see in the meeting, I think.
I was thinking about that this morning, about what's the classic awkwardness of the office party, right? These people we work with, we know them, we know about their families, we see their pictures, all that stuff. We kind of know them.
Yeah.
But then we're called to go to a party with them. And suddenly it's like, wait a minute, I've got to now pretend to be your friend. Maybe more, and it's weird, right? They classically have this weird awkwardness because of that, because we're suddenly getting thrust into a kind of, are we going to take it to a more surface level or not?
Yeah.
I think that's, for me, that was what resonated the most. Remember her story about I was being welcomed into this church by a guy who she really didn't like. She knew him in the community, didn't really like him, right? He kind of does this, welcome to the body of Christ. And she's like, the feelings mutual. But, yeah, and then she also realized that moment, she is now being called to love this person.
To do something different.
To be something different, yeah. So I think this idea of what is different about Christian community versus non-Christian community is this call to love one another. So we can have Christian communities that are very surface level, right?
I think most are.
And yeah, most are. Because it's impossible to create that type of community in a group of 200, 300, 900, 1,000 people, right? And we can have very secular groups that form that sort of really seeing one another and respecting each other's human dignity and learning to love one another and set aside small things for the sake of the bigger. That I think that happens in both. I don't think by putting Jesus, branding it as Jesus, makes one thing happen where it doesn't in the other. Does that make sense? I think it's the spirit that we bring to it. So you can bring Christ, I think, to your office party. And Christ can be totally absent from a Bible study.
Yeah, that's true. Makes sense.
So I think I would chew on that one. That was the thing that I sort of thought, what is that? How is that different? And so we can forget that Christian community happens by just showing up at church. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. Good place to start. Other thoughts? I think this question of sharing the same beliefs versus in other instances where we're really not very much the same. I guarantee you, if the five of us were to gather and really get into it, we would find that we have way more different than we have in common. But I'm still called to love you. So like family. That's why I think our marriages or long-term partnerships or whatever, our relationships are such good testing ground for this type of Christ love, right? Because what is it about marriage? We get community. I know I come from the lawyer perspective, community property. Suddenly everything I own is now yours, and everything you've got is mine, and it's all mixed, and we can't track anymore whose is whose and what's and what. That's a wildly countercultural thing, isn't it? In a country of individualism, I'm a huge advocate of marriage. I've become an evangelist for marriage with my friends. I want that connection, that commitment changes things. And so we practice what it means to be other-centered. I think having kids, is another spiritual practice for that other-centeredness, that we're called to offer to strangers. Imagine how hard it is to do that with our spouse for 20, 30 years. And I'm called to offer that same kind of love and acceptance to the stranger next door. Any other comments? Next week, we are going to talk about how place matters. Place. Anybody ever heard that term, third space? Okay, well, we'll talk about it next week. But in the meanwhile,